Well, hi there. My name's Mason Orlando, and this is Fault Summits, a history podcast about the American West. Today with me is the lovely Jess Lee
Hello, lovelies.
and the rambunctious Marcelo Aguilar.
Howdy, everybody. Rambunctious now instead of rascally. That's where we're going.
Gonna change it every time. It's
I
gonna be
kind
like
of
your
like the
outro.
rascally, though.
Really? All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Rabies infested next time.
rabies infested. I wasn't gonna go there, but you know what? I
It's season
might.
2.
Season 2. But tell us, yeah, no,
Support your trash cats.
tell us in the comments, rascally or I already forgot what I said before.
Rambunctious.
Rambunctious.
Rambunctious. Speaking rambunctious, Marcelo is going to go ahead and take the lead today with a story that I'm coming up with the wrong tone for entirely, honestly. So I'm going to go ahead and let Marcelo take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you guys. So today we are in for quite a juicy little tale. It's something that I thought might be kind of interesting to talk about because of maybe certain things going on in the world that may or may not be affecting a lot of people in our country. And I thought it might be interesting to look back and see some other times that things like this have happened and, kind of how that affected. Obviously, we're a different country than, in the past, but, kind of give us a sense of what might happen here in the next couple years. Yeah. So today, our main topic is going to be the Mexican repatriation. Are either of you guys familiar with this phrase or this event or these events?
No, not at all.
All right.
I have a
So
little
What
bit
about
of
you,
an idea.
Mason?
So, you have a
a
little
little
more than
bit,
a rough understanding
I'll,
at this point.
I'll be honest, a little more than I was expecting.
Yeah.
Because it kind of kept going, and like every little thing that I learned about, there was just like other inciting events that kind of like happened before it that led to it. It's like it's a bunch of like you don't get to this point without having a bunch of like smaller or not smaller events, but like other events that just like culminate in this. And so um for that being said, like what this thing is, what makes Mexican repatriation was in the US was referring to a mass deportation campaign that took place during the Great Depression, where Mexicans and Mexican Americans were forcibly removed from the United States, often under coercion, resulting in a significant displacement of people, and many of whom were actually U.S. citizens, and leaving a lasting impact on the country's immigration policies and ethnic relations. This practice is widely considered a form of ethnic cleansing due to its discriminatory nature based on race and not legal status. So, in this specific story that we're going to talk about, it was race based. It wasn't, you are undocumented or you are birthright or whatever. None of that mattered. You were Mexican. And so we're going to get rid of you. And so this is something
Wow.
that, yeah, it's like I said, kind of a hefty little topic we're going to be talking about today. I don't know if you guys see any kind of,
No,
maybe a little.
this episode should be releasing on January 6th. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll be yeah, breaking news. But yeah, so this is something that we're going to be talking about. This is going to be a pretty long little bit of story here, and I'm going to do my best to fill in as much as I can, historic wise, because like, I mean, I'm not a historian, I'm not a professor or anything, but there's a lot of stuff
100%.
here, and
Let's
just
be
because
very clear.
I am not a doctor, even though it does say it on the mail that shows up at my house. But
Yeah.
that's
I'll same for me. I do have my eBay account, so I will say doctor, but I am not one.
you can put Colonel on there. That might be a nice little change of pace.
Colonel
Colonel.
Doctor.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about this event and these events. And so before we get started though on the actual mass deportation that happened in the US, we're going to actually talk about something else that came before it that that kind of, yeah, paved the way for what was going to be done later. We are going to be talking about briefly the Chinese Exclusion Act that took place from 1882 all the way to 1943. Are you guys familiar with this?
Yes, I
Okay.
am, and I am just so disgusted every time I see the
It's pretty
illustrations from back then. It is just so
they're pretty I
horrifyingly bad.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I was very relieved to like do some searching and then just find one single image that had all of these things because I really didn't feel like digging around through a lot of these. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, yeah, it
um,
is so bad.
yeah. So,
This is
uh, the Chinese Exclusion Act, for those who are unfamiliar or it's been a while, after the gold rush in 1848 and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, there was a significant influx of Chinese immigrants to the United States. As the economy weakened, particularly during the Panic of 1873, economic competition led to heightened labor tensions between the Chinese workers who often accepted lower wages than their white counterparts. So basically, foreign labor came in, were willing to do the work that Americans were not for, or do the same work for less. And that caused issues, which then led to a law being passed. Basically, as you can see here in these delightful little bits of, art and newspaper clippings from back then. The first one says Chinese must go. Basically, just signs put up all around saying like kick them out. There's political cartoons. Um, Literally, Uncle Sam kicking out a you know pretty racist caricature
I
of
don't
what
like
is to
that
be like a
one.
Chinese, yeah, like
I
of a
like that.
Chinese
I
man.
hate that one the most.
Yeah, I mean, like the way that they were dressed at the time. I mean, their outfits, were similar to what you see in these cartoons, but obviously these are like racist exaggerations. But yeah, so that was kind of the mindset of like the people in the US. We're going to talk about this for a little bit just before we move on. So
So
yeah,
actually, before you flip over from this page,
yeah,
I just can't help but just find it so ridiculous. This one, it says, "Notice communists, nihilists, socialists, Finian and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen." Like, seriously?
like they're really making the point, like we will take anybody but you.
Jeez.
Yeah, like they
Oh my
it's pretty
god.
They, but they, in all fairness, they weren't really that chill to any of those folks as well.
no, yeah, and I mean just to as a perpetual reminder,
Right.
um this is
But to
this is like
basically say,
America.
"Oh, we'll literally take anybody else,"
Yeah.
like,
Anybody
yeah.
but you. Like we'll take any single damn thing except for you guys. Yeah, so a couple details about the act was, so it was officially called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It was enacted on May 6th, 1882. Its provisions included prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers to the US and denied citizen to those already present. Initially intended to last 10 years, it was extended in 1892 by the Geary Act and made permanent in 1902 before being repealed all the way to 1943. So,
Wow.
so like, yeah, so it was made permanent in 1902, and then it was just there. Like it was illegal to um basically be Chinese in 1940 until, yeah, like it's
So
crazy
until they had been our allies in
Horrifyingly
the World
sad.
War for
until they,
3 years.
it's like, well, help us out. Like you guys are good. Yeah. So some of the causes that some of the main causes that led to the Exclusion Act were, like I said, after the gold rush, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, 1869, there was the influx, there was the heightened tension between them, the lower wages, um, the racial discrimination against Asians was rampant. The so-called yellow peril, quote unquote yellow peril, which exaggerated the threat from Asian ethnicities as alien to American culture and society. This resulted in acts of violence such as the we're going to take a quick little look here. One of these acts of violence was something called the Rock Springs Massacre. Have you guys ever heard of this?
I'm not sure
I
if I have.
have. I don't think I have.
Okay, so this took place in Rock Springs, Wyoming.
No
So
surprise there.
yeah, they're like, oh, there was a nice bar there.
Oh, stop.
Um, but yeah, so what happened at the Rock Springs Massacre was it was a deadly race riot that occurred on September 2nd in 1885 in Rock Springs, Wyoming. It involved white immigrant miners who attacked their Chinese co-workers, resulting in significant loss of life and destruction. Um, the context of the massacre, excuse me, the context of the massacre was rooted in economic competition and racial tension. The Union Pacific Coal Department, uh, the Union Pacific Coal Department operated the mines in Rock Springs, employing both white and Chinese miners. The company often used Chinese labor as a cheaper alternative, which fueled resentment amongst the white miners. Additionally, anti-Chinese sentiment was widespread across the American West during this period. It was exacerbated by economic downturns and cultural differences between the Chinese miners and the white miners. Um, so the events of the actual massacre were on the morning of September 2nd in 1885. Tensions had escalated when the white miners, who were members of the Knights of Labor, um, a labor organization that had been striking against the employment of Chinese laborers, attacked their Chinese colleagues. And the violence that followed was brutal. Right now, I'm going to quote from a Wyoming history article that I found that has some descriptions of what occurred or what was seen there. Rock Springs Chinatown was gone. Even more horrifying, there were still bodies in what had been Chinatown's streets. Not that many, perhaps a dozen, 2 dozen at most. Some had been buried by the coal company, but these had not. Many were in pieces. These were bodies of their friends, sons, fathers, cousins murdered by a mob of white coal miners. Mangled and decomposed, the Chinese miners reported later to a Chinese diplomat in New York. The bodies were, quote, being eaten by hogs and dogs, end quote.
Oh my God.
So,
God, that's so awful.
yeah, so this is something that some miners who actually had come back to the town afterwards, this is what that was what the quote was what they had seen when they had come back after the white mob had come and like burnt down Chinatown. So that was what was left. The the race riot resulted in the death of at least 28 Chinese miners,
Gee.
and many others were wounded. The destruction, the rioters burned down 78 Chinese homes, effectively destroying the entire Chinatown area in Rock Springs. So the small enclave of Chinese workers who had settled there and made up their own little space for working out of. And yeah, it was gone. They they weren't very happy to have them there.
That's awful.
Yeah,
God.
it's this is one of those things that like when these tensions like rise up between like you said, like the people who are willing to do the work for less because they're hungrier for it, or they're new here, they need to like get their place, and then the ones who feel threatened by that, and if they're the ones that are dominant, I mean, as we've seen recently, violence is a pretty A to B, like, you know, turn of events. Like it's not great.
Well, I mean, you know, recently and forever, just as, when you start talking about labor history, not only do you have to talk about, violence, but you do have to talk about the extreme racist elements as well.
Yeah, because I mean it can bubble
Yeah.
up pretty quickly. I mean, it's like when there's anger when there's anger, like it's very fast for it to go downhill.
No, 100%. And it's very easy to, when people are emotional, it's very easy to kind of sway that anger, especially if it's something, destructive.
Right. It's like,
Those
hey, we want this job. They're like, well, who are you going to
creating more
blame?
destructive, you know?
Right. There's always a scapegoat, and it's just, been different classes of people, changes over time, and it's just it's all terrible.
Yeah. And I mean, it's victimizing the people who have the least amount of power, the least like, or
The
the
least amount
smallest
of
voice.
resources.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
So the aftermath of the Rock Springs massacre, there was displacement amongst the survivors. So many of them were temporarily displaced, so they had to seek refuge in nearby areas under the protection of troops that the territorial governor eventually requested from the federal government. So there was some awareness from the government that, like, there was a wrong here. So uh, there was some effort to help them resettle somewhere else. Despite the violence, many Chinese were brought back to Rock Springs under military protection to resume work, as the Union Pacific Coal Department was economically dependent on their labor. So, I mean, the company was still bringing them in just under guard. Um, and no rioters were ever persecuted. This comes as no surprise given the racial prejudice and the lack of legal protection for Chinese immigrants at the time. The event intensified debates over Chinese immigration and contributed to the strengthening of exclusionary policies, including the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So um, this was one of the things that helped continue that. So, like, let's see. The continuation of the Exclusion Act, basically what that meant was that what the act did was that it severely restricted the growth of the Chinese community in the United States for several decades. So those who remained faced legalized discrimination, limited job opportunities, segregating living conditions, and were often victims of racially motivated violence and legal injustices, just like the Rock Springs Massacre. So the family separations that happened had the act that led to long-term separations of Chinese families, as existing residents could not bring over relatives, and those outside could not join their families in the U.S. This led to an interesting thing called basically the communes of male workers that were here became bachelor societies. So, due to the restrictions of the immigration of Chinese women, predominantly male Chinese communities developed in the U.S. termed bachelor societies. And so there was this concentrated effort to say, like, we only want you, we just purely want you for your labor, and we're going to do everything we can to keep out as much as like your culture or the possibility of you like finding a life here. Like that was the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't just men who received this kind of discrimination. In the 1880s, Chinese women faced severe restrictions on immigration to the United States, largely due to discriminatory laws and the same societal prejudices that specifically targeted Chinese immigrants. The situation stemmed from a complex web of legal and social and economic factors. One of the laws that had already been in place previously that helped support this was something called the Page Act of 1875. This was one of the first restrictive immigration laws passed in the United States, which specifically targeted unquote undesirable immigrants. It effectively barred the entry of Chinese women by assuming that they were likely to engage in prostitution.
Jesus.
So
Jeez.
that's the law is that they just yeah. So the law required extensive proof that they were not arriving to engage in, quote, lewd and immoral purposes,
How?
which was
What?
nearly impossible for many to demonstrate satisfactorily. As a result, very few Chinese women could enter the U.S. legally during this period.
That's such a proof
You
that
know that was put into place purposely for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
so yeah, so
you're
that's
a
why there.
manager, Marcelo. Do you ever make your like people that are like you're interviewing be like, hey, Prove you're not here to.
Prove to me you're not a prostitute.
Yeah. Or would that be way out of line and get you fired immediately?
I mean, there would be some that would argue it's like that would be a benefit in corporate culture, like, hey, yeah, okay,
Those are
great.
people
You'll
that
go
do well
far.
in corporate culture.
Yeah, they do really, really good transactional. That's great.
I mean,
Yeah,
and just and just to remind people too that nowadays the proper term is sex worker. So
correct. Yeah,
yeah,
I like that word. It sounds more fun too. It's like
it,
it's fun and also professional.
it is professional. And I actually, and not to go too off subject here, but I think in one of the European countries recently, they just made it to where sex workers can have full benefits and maternity leave and can have
Okay.
other benefits like like other workers, which I think I'm like, why do we not have this everywhere? Do they
I
not
mean,
deserve the same benefits?
I
a lot of
believe it's
Americans don't have those benefits you just
yeah.
described,
I
but
mean, I
no, good for them. That's
no,
awesome.
I'm
but
glad they
my
do.
case in
Somebody
point
should.
is that this should be like that with every worker everywhere. But anyway,
Hey now.
Okay, so where were we? So yeah, so the Page Act, yeah, so basically impossible to like actually be real. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, whatever. Um, so the this because of the Page Act and because of the way that Chinese women were treated coming over, there was, and just Chinese in general, there was a widespread moral panic about Chinese immigrants corrupting the moral fabric of society. And this was often centered on the supposed threat posed by Chinese prostitutes, sex workers. This stereotype was exacerbated by sensationalist media and populist politicians, leading to broader support for restrictive laws. So this led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, uh, which built upon the Page Act. This law explicitly prohibited all the Chinese laborers. So it expanded from the Page Act. So the Page Act was the first, and then that then expanded into the exclusion of the male workers as well. So all bad of it. Um, so one of the things that, like, because when I was looking at this, I was like, well, this sucks. And like, this seemed like very, just a very down, like, sort of topic here, specifically this part. So I want to look around to see if maybe there was something else that had happened. Because, like, one of the things you find in these kinds of situations is that, like, unexpected, um, unexpected things can happen in these kinds of like really harsh situations. So we have a couple more images here in the slideshow of like some of the bachelor, like basically bars. So these were like the bachelor houses or the workhouses where the Chinese miners would stay. So you could see, like, you guys can see the photo, right?
yes.
So the one on the bottom left, so basically it's like a big like hall. So it's where everybody would hang out, drink, eat, chat, and then like when they weren't working, they would be there. In the top left there is the mine. So those big buildings there are the workhouses where the Chinese miners would live. On the right, there's a little bit of a little illustration um, describing the or talking about the Rock Springs massacre, and you see in the background the white mob uh, doing what white mobs do. Um, yeah. So, what the thing that I wanted to talk about, though, one of the unexpected events that happened because of all this stuff was that because of the strict regulations of Chinese immigrants, many resorted to using fraudulent means to enter the U.S., such as claiming American birthright citizenship. And this led to a phenomenon of referred to as paper sons and paper daughters. So basically, people would come in with these fake uh, IDs or whatever, and then pretend to be other people's children. And so they were always, yeah, they referred to as paper sons and daughters. One of the other thing was that because they couldn't come into the U.S. directly, they then began immigrating through Mexico. So one of the key points that they came in was they would go to travel through Mexico, where the immigration laws were less restrictive, and then attempted to cross the U.S. Mexican border into states like California and Texas. Um, this led to a significant increase in the Chinese communities that formed in northern Mexican border cities, such
Hmm.
as in Mexicali and Tijuana. These communities served as a staging ground for immigrants hoping to cross into the U.S. Like there is this neighborhood specifically in, I believe it was in Mexicali, um, maybe El Centro. It's called La Chinesca is an example of this. So La Chinesca refers to the unique Chinese community and neighborhood located in Mexicali, the capital city of Baja California. And this area has a significant historical and cultural importance due to its development as one of the largest Chinese communities in Mexico.
Hmm.
Especially prominent following the restrictive immigration policies of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is a place where a lot of Chinese immigrants settled. Um, in the early 20th century, when the Chinese immigrants that were facing discrimination in the U.S. and finding the legal barriers, too restrictive, many of them moved south and settled in Mexicali to escape the environment and find new opportunities in Mexico. Um, and they found a lot of success there. Mexicali had an economic boom because of them, particularly, well, they helped, but particularly related to their agriculture. And then later, the establishment of the Colorado River Land Company, which attracted a lot of Chinese laborers, and these laborers were instrumental in the development of the valley's irrigation system and their agricultural sector. So at one point, the Chinese population in Mexicali was so significant that they outnumbered the Mexican population. This led to the development of a vibrant community with a distinct cultural and social and economic structure. One of the other really interesting things that I learned about was they had like an underground city.
Hmm.
So um, in the city that they in the in La Chinesca, like on the streets, you'd see what you see, but underneath all many of the houses was a network of basements and tunnels.
Interesting.
Um, and it was referred to as an underground city. These were initially used for various purposes, including extra housing, secondary businesses, and as a refuge from the harsh desert climate. Over time, these underground spaces became a unique characteristic of the community. Although many of them aren't in use anymore, but they're still there. Like there's these tunnels underneath the city that people would use to basically have their own like underground market. Um,
Like literally underground or
Yeah,
like
literally
up above?
underground. Like they would dig underneath, like under tunnels
Okay,
underground.
but was it illegal
Oh
or were they
wow.
just conducting business at the lower level?
Both. It was well, I think to a certain extent it was tolerated. It was known, but it wasn't like well known. You know what I mean? Like it was but yeah, it was a method for like in many immigrant communities, like you have to sometimes find a way. Like if there's not a system in place, as long as there are other people from your similar background, like there's networks that can be built, you know?
Right.
Um and literally in this case was an underground network.
Huh.
Um
Wow.
Honestly, when I
No,
was thinking about it, I kept thinking of like Fallout.
I mean,
That's what it
kind of. I
sounds
mean,
like.
it's interesting to me that like Mexico, like more than a few times has been the refuge for like Americans that were just being like pushed out for whatever reason, rather it be the Chinese or even the Mormons that were just like, there's literally an order in America to exterminate us, so a bunch of them went to Mexico.
Yeah,
You could also do their polygamy thing there, but
to an
that's why
extent.
there's still a large Mormon presence in Mexico, even though, that's it's a big part of their history as well, is all I'm saying. It's just
For sure.
interesting that Mexico is always, there's been a few times where Mexico has played that part for folk.
Yeah, 100%. Um, yeah, so I mean, like the government was aware of these migration routes in Mexico or around Mexico and in Texas. And so what they did was then they began to increase the surveillance and the routes that they would be patrolling along the border. So this was actually one of the first times, if not the first time, that um, the southern border with Mexico was militarized. So like what we have now today came from this. came from trying to stop Chinese laborers from coming into the U.S. through Mexico.
And what year was this?
This was let's see, 1882 was when the act was begun.
Okay. 18, wow. Yeah, because
Yeah, right.
that was far before like when Pancho Villa um, invaded that one time.
Mhm.
That was like
Y-
what, 1912, 1916?
Yeah. So yeah, and this was yeah, and that was like
I didn't know the border was militarized that long beforehand. That's all.
yeah. I mean, well, militarized for one group of people, you know.
Gotcha.
Everyone else like, ah, you guys are good. You guys have been here. We know you, but then eventually that changed too.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. So yeah, so obviously since when borders are created, networks will be, like I said, like we talked about, like there are networks of people that will develop here in these towns to help support newcomers to getting across. So smuggling networks developed to assist the Chinese immigrants in crossing the border, and this often involved bribes to the border officials or using the false identities and documents, like we talked about the paper sons and paper
Yeah.
daughters.
Yeah.
Um, as far as the long-term impact of this in Mexico, the Chinese communities grew over time, and while many immigrants eventually made their way into the United States, a significant number remained in Mexico, contributing to the multicultural fabric of northern Mexican cities, which like in like El Centro, Mexico, El Centro here at Southern California, you can go and get some really incredible Chinese food. Like I've gone in a couple of road trips. It is significantly better than the stuff that I've had around my area. Granted, I live in San Diego, so it's fine.
Oh,
Whatever.
wow.
Come at me, guys. Come at me. I don't care.
I did
Um,
not know that about El Centro.
yeah, it's really, really great. And it's like I've had like Chinese food from in New York, and I understood the difference. I don't remember if it's, I believe there it's Cantonese, and then here it's Mandarin.
Hmm.
Um, but like it was the food from there was just so good. Give it a shot if you guys are ever through El Centro. Um,
Well,
I would definitely love to try it.
yeah. Let's see. So the other thing here is the um so as far as the Chinese people who are trying to come and work and try to do this, like try to find a better life for themselves, um they did contribute to the legal system in a significant way in which the Chinese community fought back through the courts, resulting in significant legal decisions on citizenship and civil rights in the U.S. Notable cases like the United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898 established that children born in the U.S. to foreign parents were indeed U.S. citizens under the 14th Amendment. That is birthright citizenship.
right.
So
Yeah.
Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants who were not eligible to become citizens under the Chinese Exclusion Act. When Wong returned to the United States from a trip to China, immigration officers denied him entry. Wong then sued the federal government, arguing that he was a U.S. citizen under the 14th Amendment. The ruling of this led to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor to Mr. Ark. He ruled 6-2 in favor for Wong Kim Ark, establishing that all people born in the United States are citizens by birth, regardless of their parents' race, nationality, or status. Obviously, this is like a significant thing that is kind of again bubbling up right now.
Yeah.
I
So
did not know that ruling was that old.
I didn't know that this guy was the first person to do it
Huh.
because I read this and I was like, well, thanks, bro. Like that's why I'm here.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so this ruling, as many people may know, led to the uh, protection of U.S. born descendants of immigrants from being denied citizenship. So it also establishes that the concept of just just solely citizenship, which has been accepted by lower courts and has not been seriously questioned by the Supreme Court as of the time of this recording. So,
Hmm.
yeah, so this is still up and running for now. Yeah, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943 during World War II, when China was an ally against the Axis powers, ironically reflected the changing attitudes towards Chinese Americans, who were now seen as partners in the fight for freedom, rather than threats. And so that was when the act was repealed.
Huh.
And
Wow.
Yeah.
so, now having had that little chunk of time, we're gonna go ahead and just jump right back to the 30s, to 1930s, and just have a quick little catch up on the Great Depression. So, this is what's going on in the U.S. at the moment. Is we're going through the Great Depression, the beginning that began with the stock market crash in October of 1929 triggered one of the most severe downturns in American history. The banks failed, the businesses shuttered, and unemployment skyrocketed, leaving millions of Americans jobless and struggling to meet their basic needs. This crisis created a widespread insecurity, and as the economic pain deepened, many people looked for quick solutions to reduce competition for jobs and resources. So,
Hmm.
guess where that might be going.
I don't know.
So as here, let me switch our slide over so we can take a look at some of our key players here. So from this point on, we're going to be these guys aren't going to be our main topics, but they're going to be kind of popping in here and throughout the story. So first we have Herbert Hoover, who was our president from 1929 to 1933.
Vacuum.
Um, Martin There you
Boo.
go. The no Hoover heads here. That's fine. We also have Martin Dies, who was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Texas from 31 to 45. He will be popping in here in the story. He's not super well known, but we'll get to meet him soon. And then
So
of course,
is it
I like him.
pronounced dies or D's?
I kept saying Dies because once I read his story, I kind of wished that upon him.
Well, if that's
Fair
how you
enough.
pronounce it, that's cool because like that's the last sentence of his life
There you go.
in the story.
Martin
Indeed.
dies,
Nice.
period. And then, of course, FDR, who um, was not the person who started the Mexican repatriation, but continued it along. So it began under Hoover, but continued throughout until it continued throughout because of the contributions that these gentlemen helped along in historical events. So. Um, in the environment of the U.S. right now during the Great Depression, as jobs became scarce, immigrants, particularly Mexican laborers, were cast as easy scapegoats. Beginning around the 1890s, new industries in the U.S. Southwest, especially mining and agriculture, attracted Mexican laborers. The Mexican Revolution from 1910 to 1920 then increased the flow of war refugees and political exiles to the United States to escape the violence that was happening in their home country. Um, Mexicans also left rural areas in search of stability and employment, and as a result, Mexican migration to the United States rose sharply. The number of legal immigrants grew from around 20,000 migrants per year during the 1910s to about 50,000 to 100,000 migrants per year during the 1920s. So, like a significant increase in the amount of people that were coming. Um, and this is according to a blog from the Library of Congress. These facts, or excuse me, these figures, previously welcomed for their labor in agriculture, railroads, and other sectors, they were now seen by some as taking work that should go to struggling American citizens. So this shift in perception was compounded by a growing belief that reducing the foreign-born population could ease the burden on public assistance programs, freeing up jobs and social resources for native-born Americans.
Huh.
So this was the reasoning behind doing this. You guys see here, like in this slide, just a photo here of Mexican laborers being brought to the U.S. or excuse me, being trained they from Texas, I believe. And so like there was a very welcoming environment for the labor when it was necessary, when it was needed to, help the country build up. Um, but once things started getting scarce, then they were seen as the easiest way to fix the problem, not hurting any Americans. Let's get these guys out that we invited in, and this is how we're going to fix our problems. So the local and federal officials responded to these economic pressures by initiating Mexican repatriation campaigns, which were a mix of forced deportations and quote unquote voluntary departures under threat. So between 400,000 and 1 million people of Mexican descent, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were either coerced or pressured to leave. These efforts were framed as necessary for economic relief measures, and with public support, they were fueled by racist and nativist sentiment and a desire for economic recovery. So in this very tense climate, Mexican repatriation became a stark example of how the economic hardship could fuel these kinds of policies. Um, During the 30s, the political atmosphere in the U.S. was defined by economic insecurity, isolationist tendencies, and a rise in outwardly racist attitudes, especially towards immigrants. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, brought severe unemployment and widespread poverty, fueling demands to prioritize jobs and resources for American citizens. Adding to this was the national attitude towards isolationist policies in the aftermath of World War I. So, in this climate, immigrants were increasingly portrayed as competitors for scarce work and social support, and calls to protect American jobs for Americans, quote, American jobs for Americans grew louder. So, this era had already seen a growing support for immigration restrictions with the Johnson-Reed Act, also known as the Immigration Act of 1924. The act was named after Senator John W. Reed,
Hmm.
who I
Heard of
look.
this?
You've heard of this? You've heard of this? You heard of this?
I hated this.
Um,
You had to just.
yeah. So Johnson Reed, who
It's not the best.
yeah, not the best. Yeah, so Johnson W. Reed, who I'm just going to go ahead and assume is probably an asshole. This act imposed strict quotas, largely targeting specific ethnic groups. Although this law preceded the Depression, its passage reflected a broader trend of preferring a more restricted and selective approach to immigration.
Huh.
With the Depression deepening, this sentiment evolved into a push for removing immigrants perceived as economic burdens, with Mexican and Mexican American communities often facing heightened scrutiny.
Wait.
Yeah. And due to their role in various labor sectors, they were targeted. So the the Johnson Reed Immigration Act. The Johnson Reed Immigration Act severely limited immigration to the United States, and it was based on eugenic principles and the goal of keeping American white and Protestant. So, yeah. So Johnson Reed sounds like kind of an asshole.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I would think
he
so.
wrote that, right? He
Yeah,
wrote all that stuff you just said.
right. And yeah, so
He
in
said it out
addition,
loud.
not a lot of ways you can go after all that. So, in addition to opposition to immigrants from China and Eastern and Southern Europe, a variety of interest groups, including small farmers, labor unions, eugenicists, and racists, had called for restrictions on Mexican immigration. Their arguments focused primarily on competition for jobs and the cost of public assistance for indigents. These arguments intensified with the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929, which exacerbated the pervasive racist, xenophobic, and nativist sentiments. Oh, and then also they were anti-Semitic too. So all of these things were kind of bubbling around at the same time.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
Just
that
all the
little
things.
that little gumbo of terribleness.
No, I
That mixed up jambalaya.
I'm working on a script where we'll be talking about this era in history and the people that use similar situations to achieve their political goals. But
Hmm.
leave it at that.
Yeah, that's it is
Yeah.
the common denominator.
Yeah.
So yeah, in this environment, local environments under pressure to address economic hardships began to view immigrant removal as a way to reduce welfare costs. So coordinated efforts began between local authorities and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and state welfare departments aim to remove or encourage Mexican and Mexican American families to leave.
Do they have a definition of what encouragement?
They kept it pretty quote unquote vague. But they do have some, I do have a couple of examples of some of the things that they would do. Mainly it was very aggressive, like requests for information or invasive, like the INS would come and basically, um, you know, raid them. Like it would just show up at their house and then bring them into custody so that they can prove their status. And people would just get swept up. So adding this, let's see. Yeah, so these policies gained public approval as many Americans worried about their own livelihoods and saw repatriation as a quick fix to free up resources and jobs. Public opinion during this time was often shaped by simplistic, generalized portrayals of immigrant communities, portraying them as outsiders taking from an already strained system. So this is you okay there, Mace?
Yeah, no, I just glad this is all behind us.
So glad we figured this out, right?
Glad we don't have to worry about this anymore.
Glad this isn't a thing I'm going to turn on the radio right now and have to hear.
Oh, no, it's on the AM.
um, yeah, so so this is the mindset of these people, like thinking that this is how we solve our problems, and just adding on top of this to this atmosphere was a pretty isolationist stance within the US. The country was still recovering from the fallout of World War One and was largely focused on like its domestic affairs. It was hesitant to want to extend its resources or attention outside of its own borders, which, like, yeah, fair. You did just fight a war. Um, this inward-looking perspective, though, often led to limited empathy towards immigrant communities, usually seen as peripheral to the quote-unquote core American population. So policies that prioritized native-born Americans in times of hardship were rarely questioned. So as the nation looked to stabilize its economy and regain its sense of control. So, like the people who were born here get first dibs is essentially what they're, like everyone else, like you guys don't matter. So
Yeah.
federal and local
Oh,
officials, go
was
ahead,
it
Mace.
for all the people that were born here or just some?
The ones that look right.
Gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah, there's that thing that people say. It's like, unless you, whatever, it's like of an indigenous person. It's like, unless you look like me, at some point you came here. And yeah, um, so the where we were here. Oh, so the federal and local officials faced with pressure to provide quick economic solutions by the public, often leaned into repatriation as an immediate means to reduce costs. So as like a quick fix. Programs like the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt sought to address broader economic recovery, but at the local level, immigrant communities often became easy targets in attempts to appear responsive to voter concerns. So leaders aim to be seen as prioritizing real Americans in their recovery efforts, creating a normalized acceptance of policies that disproportionately affected immigrant groups.
I
Uh,
can't believe that.
Oh, really? You
huh.
can't
Gonna need to
believe
see the
that?
sources.
I'm gonna tell you something. As I was writing this thing, like every other paragraph that I wrote or every other bit of information that I read, I was just like, that was my response, was like, guys, we're still doing this. This
Yeah.
is still a thing.
Yeah, it's God.
It's yeah. Um yeah, so in this climate, exclusionary measures gain support, why not? And when everyone is when with the world in the way that it was, the public justified this as a means to ease an economic pressure and restore a sense of order. So, with the emphasis on economic recovery for Americans, harsh policies towards immigrants were viewed as necessary, not only to save jobs and reduce spending, but to reinforce an idea of who belonged and who did not. A theme that, as we've been saying, subtly echoes across time. Um, yeah, so we're going to start talking about here. Let's see. So we're going to start getting here into the actual, um, like the specifics of the repatriation program and like how it worked, the amount of people that it got taken through. We're going to go through um, a couple different examples of like different cities where it happened and how it happened. So yeah, so all the questions that we got about like fire them off, you guys. Like I said, I've been reading this thing for a couple of weeks now, and my brain is kind of cooked from all the random history information about this.
Yeah.
Salud.
I assume you had this big push from a lot of people everywhere, but do you know specifically what areas of the United States were most in favor of this, or was it just more of a general
It was
sentiment?
based on like the overall like federal mandate was, to try to provide resources to the Americans after the Great Depression to try to get them back on their feet. But the specific things about the immigration stuff, that was left locally. So it really was like town
Gotcha.
to town. Like certain towns were just like, well, we want to get rid of these people. So they had basically a corporate mandate to do the things that they had wanted to do. And this is like I'm gonna see like in different cities, it was done differently and it was done to different extents. But yeah, it was basically just like a thumbs up from the government saying that
Green light.
yes, like a green light. And so every city took it upon themselves to enact it their own way or whether or not they did it.
Again, I can't believe that.
Yeah. So, um,
Now, this was, and again, another question, like this was a time where like I assumed that like, migration was still like a pretty common thing as far as like there'd still be or there would be farmers that would have, hire people from Mexico coming up through the border seasonally, and then they would, go back down. That was still a big part of like, Mexican and American life back then, correct?
oh yeah, 100%. So yeah, at the time that was the relationship was that again before the Exclusion Act, before the border began to get militarized, there was this like sense of like different countries of course, but like there was this sense of like kind of people move back and forth as was needed, you know? And yeah, like the labor was welcomed, it was brought up because it was necessary to help build up these agricultural industries. Um, but once the depression hit, then it was like, well, who's the easiest people that we can kick out that, there was a like more of a sense of like um it was more of like a what can we do to show people that we're doing something? Like
Right.
that was really the main driver behind a lot of these things was that these were not actually going to positively affect them like in a big way financially or economically. It was to make people feel like something was being done on their behalf.
Right, right. And you've seen this almost every day since the time we're talking about. Um, but yeah, I just kind of feel like there's better way to like feed into the public's urge to be like, we need something right now. We need action.
Yeah, we
Like
need some
they were
support.
spending, they were and are spending all this money on like harassing all these people. It's like you could just, I don't know, give that money to people.
Yeah, you could just like give it back to like the
Here's $100, everyone. Calm down.
no,
We're
we're gonna spend
Americans. We'd probably wait another year and be happy with another $100 next year.
another
Get a
stimmy and
check
then
from
we'll be
grandma,
good. Yeah. So what we're gonna do is we will go through yeah, some of the examples of what repatriation looked like. And then I think after that we'll be able to wrap it up for tonight because I still got a lot of stuff about the lives of all the people that I got moved out of the US and then taken to Mexico and how that went. Spoiler alert there, it's not great. But so we'll go through a couple of the
I mean, not surprised, but
yeah. So the plan here was with the repatriation. So between 1929 and 1939, an estimated 1 to 2 million people of Mexican descent were pressured, coerced, or forced to leave the U.S., with many of those people being U.S. citizens. So with the onset of the Great Depression, unemployment and poverty were scarce and unemployment and poverty unemployment was scarce and poverty was rampant in the US, and that led many to view the Mexican laborers as competition for the scarce jobs and work. This was despite the fact that Mexicans had been actively recruited to the US as laborers during times of the economic growth, such as in agriculture, mining, and railroad industries. So, local and federal government officials, in coordination with immigration with the INS, initiated a series of raids, detentions, and voluntary deportations efforts targeting Mexican communities. This, especially in California, Texas, and Michigan. The official intent was to ease the economic burdens by reducing the foreign-born population and freeing up jobs for the real Americans. Between 400,000 and 1 million Mexican and Mexican Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were deported or coerced into leaving. This is detailed in one of the books that I read, which I forgot to mention at the beginning, my sources a lot, but the main ones that I had really dug into was my main source was the book called Decade of Betrayal, which is a very extensive account of the atmosphere of the U.S. and also the disruption on the individuals, firsthand accounts and stuff like that. The other book was called Harvest of Empire, which goes over the history from the Exclusion Act until 1943, and then also some other things beyond that. And then the other book that we'll talk about more, I think, on the next episode, which would be the book is called They Should Stay There, which was a perspective of repatriation from the Mexican side of both the people that were sent there and also the Mexicans who were receiving them, and how that all went down. So that being said, I'm going to quote here I'm going to be, these next couple of examples I'm going to be talking about came from Decade of Betrayal. Example from Decade of Betrayal was that in Los Angeles was one of the epicenters of repatriation efforts, where coordinated raids targeted Mexican communities and often indiscriminately. So the INS, working with local authorities, would conduct sweeps in Mexican neighborhoods and public spaces. People were arrested in their homes, their workplaces, and even on public transportation, with little regard for citizenship statuses. So I have here a firsthand account. So basically, the INS would come into Mexican neighborhoods, and like I was saying, like they would just sweep everyone. So if you were taking a bus, like a public bus, and you looked Mexican and the INS was there, they could sweep you. You were coming from school, you were at work, like whatever, they had a blanket, they had a mandate to have a blanket sweep of everyone and collecting everyone that they considered to be, or everyone that was suspected to be a non-citizen. So I have here a firsthand account from Decade of Betrayal. So one person that was repatriated recalled, quote, "We were so scared. We didn't know where to go. They told us we weren't welcome here anymore," end quote. Balderrama and Rodriguez the authors of the book, document how fear gripped the entire neighborhoods, as families lived in constant fear of being forcibly removed, even if they were legal U.S. citizens. So many were swept up without time to gather belongings, forced to leave everything behind in a sudden and traumatic expulsion from their homes or from their workplaces. From a History.com article called The Deportation Campaigns of the Great Depression, one of the issues is the repatriation took place without any legal protections in place or any kind of due process. Says Kevin R. Johnson, the author of the article, who is a dean and professor of public interest and law of Chicano Studies at the University of California. He also said that so you could argue that all of them were unconstitutional. So all of them were illegal because no modicum of process was followed in any of these sweeps. So um,
Huh.
instead, yeah, so all of these sweeps could be considered illegal because there was no legal representation. There was no legal explanation for their status. They were just picked up.
Well, just do it and talk about it later. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, 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 they'll figure it out. Yeah,
Foo, as usual.
That
yeah.
that is just so crazy.
It
Um,
when I read
and
it, I felt like I was missing something. I was like, you can't just snatch people out of off a bus, but
You
they
can't,
did.
but we're doing it.
like snatching them from work and from school and from their own like you can't even function in your own home without the fear of somebody coming and grabbing you.
Yeah, yeah,
God.
just
Literal nightmare, living in
Yeah, it's
fear.
totally not still happening today
yep.
too.
Once again, not relevant at all. Um, so Yeah, so and continue from the article. So instead, local governments and officers simply arrested and put them on trucks, buses, or trains bound for Mexico. Um, Regardless of whether they were documented immigrants or even native-born citizens, deporters rounded up children and adults however they could, often raiding public places where they thought Mexican Americans hung out. In 1931, one Los Angeles raid rounded up more than 400 people at La Placita Park and deported them to Mexico. Um,
Jesus.
So were they just at the park, like hanging out,
Yes,
like on a
yes.
Sunday?
They were just
Just
hanging out
mind
at the park.
just existing, just minding their own
So
business.
here, let me switch over to a couple of images here to show you what, yeah, like what was going on at the time or like what it looked like. So here, like this is the train station on the far right, um, of a bunch of people who were being told like get on your train and go to Mexico. Like you're not welcome here anymore. In the middle, you see families uh,
God.
being just, they're all waving goodbye because they're all being put on trains and then being sent away to Mexico. Family on the far left changing a tire as they were trying to drive, getting all their belongings and leaving their city. Um, let's
God,
see.
it's so sad. Those
And
poor children.
like this, it happened so fast. It happened so fast and it happened so like without like I mean I knew slightly of this kind of stuff, but I didn't know like all like it happened like this, you know what I mean? Like this was never a big conversation at school.
Right.
Yeah. You did that, yeah, you don't learn about any of this, like, well,
Remember that
especially
time?
where I grew up at, you're not taught
Well,
any of this.
me and Marcelo grew up in commie California, and so they, of course, had
In
no time for this when they
I
were
don't
California.
remember
just
I don't remember having this
bombarding
conversation, man. This would have I would have paid
person.
attention to
Yeah, no,
this.
this was not brought up, even though it happened like right where we were being taught history.
Yeah. Well, we were being taught some of the highlights. We weren't being taught all the ugly parts.
We got to build submissions.
So yeah, so the
Yeah,
logic behind
no
these raids
surprise with that, though.
was that
With, not being taught like, even though the 2 of you grew up in, um, California, that they wouldn't have talked about this.
well, I mean, there's some stories that you can end with like a somewhat happy or hopeful ending. And then there's other ones that are like too based in reality, so you really can't have them
Yeah,
end with a happy ending because they're still ongoing. And this was like, I mean, yeah, man, like the attitude of towards like immigrants hasn't like you said hasn't changed. So it's like they're always the first at bat to be like the ones to blame.
right.
Um
Well, and even today, like, school books, they only wanna teach the history that's favorable. Like, for example, when I was, I mean, sorry I'm going off subject about this. When I was growing up in the South, and you learned about somebody, let's say, for example, Helen Keller, they only tell you the information they want you to know. They don't go into what she did after,
Yeah.
into her
They don't
adulthood.
tell you all the
They
cool
don't
shit.
they don't tell you about like her what she did as an activist and what
Right.
she did in politics. You don't know anything. It's like pretty much you learn about everything that she did in her childhood, and you learn that she graduated high school, and then it just ends right there. They don't teach you
Not
anything else past that.
Yeah, not to like it's I don't I to be perfectly honest with you, I honestly thought Helen Keller was like a folk story until I was like in my 20s. Like until
Oh, no,
somebody actually showed me was like, no, 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 no. This is like a
she was
real
a
woman and
real
she did like
person.
a bunch of stuff. And I was like, oh, I didn't know any of this.
I mean, in
Oh,
all
yeah.
fairness, I feel like that is actually something they didn't spend a lot of time with us in like California schools was Helen Keller. Like, Jess, did you hear about the Donner Party when you were in school in Florida?
Ab Absolutely not.
Yeah, we learned about it in like fourth grade for some reason. It took like 2 weeks for them to joyfully tell us the story. And to be honest, it
But
was
they
amazing.
Yeah,
yeah,
it was the
they
first time
did
I
let
cared.
they like we would learn about like the different Spanish explorers, but you didn't hear any of the gross stories about like, how they abused the native people.
Yeah, they just hang yeah. Well, I mean, it is the thing, like
They came to find the fountain of youth, and then it's just like, all right,
and
well,
then they just became
what else did
peaceful
he
and
do? Well,
chill and
that's it.
now we have 7-Elevens, That's
They
how that
came for
Yeah.
the
works.
fountain of youth, but what they found was a party.
With so much
Bow,
more.
bow, 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 bow.
Enter alligators.
Dancing alligators.
Oh God!
Well,
What are those huge floating things in the water? What do you call them? Manatees?
Sharp claws.
okay, so we're just gonna go through a couple of very yeah, just a couple little things here. So one of the examples that we were talking about was yeah, how these raids like how they went, like how they rounded up people, like what was the reasoning behind it. One of the examples that I found was of this young woman in the photo here on the you guys can see the screen, right? The
Yes.
so
Yes.
this is Emma Gomez. In the photo there, she was 14, and she just for those listeners, um, what she had written was that her family had lived in Erie, and what she talked about, like how her family was responding to the what's it called, like their family's response to the raids and how they reacted. Mace, do you want to read that one there for our listeners? That little blurb.
Sure. My family lived in Erie, and my father had taken me along to shop in Longmont. I think I was about 7 or 8, so it was about 1935 or 36. I witnessed police escorting Mexican families out of Longmont in caravan. The police would stop occasionally and grab any Mexican looking individual and throw them into one of the trucks if they lacked identification. Later in life, I would recall that incident. I realized the police weren't distinguishing between citizens and non-citizens. If you were Mexican, you were gone.
So just again, like to really emphasize the thing of
Yeah.
like there was no like, well, they're the legal one. It's like, no, 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 no. You. Like it was just down to that.
It's
Uh
basically just if you looked like you didn't belong there, then they would just take you.
if you weren't white, you were gone. Like that's
Yeah.
what it was.
Again, I just can't even think of a time when the police would do. Sorry, the bit's old. I don't like it anymore.
Yeah, so here are some more images here. So here again at the train station, you see here long lines of people, of men who are being all these are all men that are being deported.
Oh
Um
god.
you'll also see like a couple of little extras. I actually went through, so again, this is the research. I went through several of your guys's state libraries and
Well, shit,
found
this is
like,
Longmont, Colorado?
yeah, I went
Oh,
through
I thought
like,
you were talking about
Wow.
Indiana.
I was wondering about that.
yep, no, yeah. I went through your guys's like newspaper stuff. Yeah,
Wow.
so like this was
I
like
like I love the dedication you put into this.
Are we? Thank you, Marcelo.
I told you, man, my brain's been cooking with this thing for a little bit,
Yeah.
and podcast aside, like, I know we want to try to keep this evergreen, but like, yeah, man, like I've been having some anxiety thoughts about my stuff in my life, especially given
Yeah.
the turn of the world right now. So this kind of stuff has been very helpful in like helping me learn, like what happened before.
Yeah.
What can this look like? Like what can happen? And so yeah, just to continue on with more of these
I
this is
kind of
what
like some of the some of the headlines, like Cassidy sees 15,000 Mexicans loaded on trains. That's
it
heck.
and you notice the size of the notes of like the on the newspaper. Like they're not headlines. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? Like they're just like little, like it's just happening. It's like little, oh, 300 gone, 1,500 gone. Like it's just one thing, like it's quietly getting them out. Um another let me see.
yeah. No,
Mm,
there's you also see the headline bonus army causing worries. That was when all those veterans from World War I were pretty much marching on to Washington so they could get fair compensation.
yep.
Um, yeah,
Here
that's a lot
here we have
of things
a couple
going on
more.
in that paper.
Yeah.
No.
What did you
That
see?
one newspaper, the one in the top right corner, they use that word.
Hmm.
Oh my
Oh,
god.
oh, no, 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 no. Okay, so for our audience, the title of the headline is 500 nab by LA Wetback Raiders.
Oh,
And they're not talking about a football team. Um, but yeah, so the other thing about that word, which is a slur, uh, just in the future, I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert here. There is an
Okay.
official federal immigration operation that is called Operation Wetback. That is
that's
its
right.
official name.
I have heard of that before, and
So yeah,
it is, yeah, still
they
awful.
they really, speaking of not being tired of the bit, they are not tired of this bit.
Right.
Yeah, so these are all as you can see here, like again, another train shipped yesterday, 600 more Mexicans to be deported. Like it is continuous. It is
5 straight rifle shots, peril woman.
yeah. So
God. 4 trucks carry Larimer County Mexicans to Denver today. Boulder County group to leave next week. Must be natives of Mexico to return. Jeez, man.
they say must be, but pretty sure they were just gonna take whoever was like, oh yeah, you said he's one of them, let's go.
A
Must leave
Um,
state
must
or go to
leave
penal
state.
farm.
I
Police
was just,
teams will
yeah.
clash tomorrow. What does that mean? Is that a football game or something?
let's see. And so what else did we have here? Oh, and so I have here another example or another account from somebody. So in 2003, a Detroit-born U.S. citizen named Jose Lopez testified before a California legislative committee about his family's 1931 deportation to Michoacan. Michoacan is a state in western Mexico. It is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. I've been there twice. But I think it was a little bit different back then. So let's see. So Mr. Lopez said, quote, I was 5 years old when we were forced to relocate, he said. I became very sick with whooping cough and suffered very much, and it was difficult to breathe. After both of his parents and one brother died in Mexico, he and his surviving siblings managed to return to the U.S. in 1945. Quote, we were lucky to come back, quote, end quote. He said, quote, but there are others that were not so fortunate. So
God.
the so the raids tore apart. Yeah, sorry guys. I told you this was a heavy, juicy episode.
Because, yeah, you were not lying.
So the raids tore apart families and communities, leaving lasting trauma for Mexican Americans who remained in the United States. Former California State Senator Martha M. Escutia has said that growing up in East Los Angeles, her immigrant grandfather never even walked to the corner grocery store without his passport for fear of being stopped and deported. Even after he became a naturalized citizen, he continues to carry it with him to this day. So, like, this is,
It's serious.
Well, I mean, a part of it to me thinks that like a lot of these like reactionary policies, even if they don't get their goals of deporting everyone, but a lot of it is just fear tactics to like keep everyone else in line. It's like, look what we could do. And you see this over and over again with different groups of people. However, those different groups of people, they tend to get picked on over and over again through different parts of history. But, it's just, yeah, I don't know what else to say. Just noticing shit.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the next part here, I just have this little thing. Jess, would you mind reading this text here on the screen?
I would be happy to. The government for Sorry, let me start over. The government formally deported around 82,000 Mexicans from 1929 to 1935. This constituted a significant portion of the Mexican population in the US. By one estimate, one fifth of Mexicans in California were repatriated by 1932, and one third of all Mexicans in the US between 1931 and 1934.
So that's a lot.
That is, my God, that is, oh, yeah,
It's a lot of people.
so many people.
And we're gonna get to
So many
let's
innocent people.
and I mean, we're pretty much here. We're gonna wrap up here soon with the just two more cities and two different ways. Because so two more different ways that this was done. So in LA, the raids were like the main method to get people. It was like the biggest like broad sweep thing, like we were talking about. Another way that this was done was also in through, like we said, voluntary threats. Remember how we were talking about earlier? How I was saying like there was a voluntary repatriation, like you say, hey, I want to go back.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so the way that this was done, one of the ways that was like most successful was through coercion in places like Detroit through the welfare system.
Hmm.
So in Detroit, local welfare agencies under financial strain during the Great Depression pressured Mexican American families. Now, Mexican American families, like actual U.S.,
Right.
some people in the family were U.S. citizens, or if not all, um, families to accept voluntary repatriation. So welfare officials threatened to cut off aid, telling families that they would no longer receive public assistance if they did not agree to leave for Mexico. So in 1929, Congressman Martin Dies, that's that guy from earlier,
yeah.
argued in the Chicago Herald Examiner that quote, the large alien population is the basic cause of unemployment. That's
Huh.
it. uh,
Jeez.
Dies was bolstered by independent groups such as the Federation of Labor, the AFL, and the National Club of America for Americans, who supported deportation of Mexican immigrants as a means to free up jobs for U.S. citizens. So the latter group urged Americans to pressure the government into deporting Mexicans. Dies worked as an attorney in Marshall, Texas, and Orange, Texas, and eventually became a district judge. In 1931, Dies was elected from the Texas Second District to the House of Representatives, a constituency that his father represented for a decade. So he had become a second generation Democratic U.S. congressman. And in 1938, he started as chairman of the Special Committee to investigate un-American activities and
Oh.
remained at its helm
Oh.
until 1944. At ease
Gross.
at ease with newsmen, Dies was frequently in the national media spotlight. So, like I said, a real asshole.
Yeah, I realize I don't think Texas has changed all that much.
No, I mean they're consistent, you know. They
Right?
like what they like.
They got Musk. They got Musk now. They're going to space. They're bringing Texas to space.
I hope they put rockets on it and it flies up like from that Avengers movie.
Yeah, I hope they put mountainous boulders on all of that because
Yeah, if America
That
just
said,
got a nuke.
I would like to thank our two listeners out in Texas and all our Texas listeners. We do love
Welcome, new
you.
Texas listeners. We
You
are
understand that, we have our differences up here in Colorado and California, but feel free to reach out and talk a little shit. We're all friends here,
yeah,
but
100%. Just
you
keep
made
your
it
I
corn
hope
out of
they
my
throw
food.
interesting. I'm laughing a
I
little
hope
bit.
they
I don't
throw
know.
sugar in the engine tanks without anybody on them, just saying.
Of the bad people in Texas, you mean Jess, right?
What's that?
Of the bad people in Texas, you mean Jess, right?
Sure.
The only bad people in Texas are the ones that put corn in Mexican food. That's it. Those are the only bad ones.
Actually, no,
Legitimate.
they're not the only
How
bad ones,
dare
but they
you?
are bad ones for
They're
some.
some of the worst.
How dare
I
you?
did have a friend from Texas, and we would get into drunken squabbles over that.
Look, my mom was the arbiter of that one. She talked some shit, and I was like, I'm on mom's side.
I'm on, I didn't even know
I'm
your
on
mom was
mom's
on the right
side.
side, but I mean, of course she is. Of course.
Okay, so back to this little wonderful story. So let's go through the apprehension process, guys. So how this worked out. So
Oh no.
so once once Mexican Americans were apprehended, requesting a hearing was a possibility, but immigration officers rarely informed individuals of their rights, and the hearings were quote official but informal. In that immigration inspectors quote acted as the interpreter, accuser, judge, and jury. So,
Like Judge
moreover,
Dredd?
yeah, basically the immigration officer was just a one and done. Like they just decided your whole thing right then and there. They were immigration judge dread.
Damn, dude.
um yeah, in fact, let's take a quick little peek here just to give you guys a sense of what these fellas look like, the immigration officers.
Oh, God. Have you ever seen Cool Hand Luke for our listeners?
Yeah, the sweatiest
Oh
movie
my
in existence.
god.
It really is.
So
That's
here
horrible.
is
Yeah, no, it
That picture on the far right is like the absolute worst. Like,
can you read that out loud, the
yeah.
text? It's a little choppy there, but
oh,
Wadsworth McB. I'm guessing those are the officers' names. The Border Patrol's quote smallest catch. El Paso, Texas, about 1929.
God.
So this is a picture of two border patrols who have a small child in between them.
See
And
all the
that's why
dollars?
it says smallest catch. The child cannot be any more than about 4 or 5 years old.
yep. So this was like, as again as an example, like this is the way that they like perceive these people, like these
Like, they
people
don't even see them as, like, legitimate human beings.
and like before this law was passed, they were their like neighbors, and they were the people that in some cases had been there longer than they had.
Yeah.
But you know, the law happened. Um, so talking about the apprehension process, so as you see here, like it was pretty sweeping. If no hearing was requested, the second option of those who were apprehended was to voluntarily deport themselves from the U.S. So, in theory, this would allow these individuals to re-enter the U.S. legally at a later date because, quote, no arrest warrant was issued and no legal record or judicial transcript of the incident was kept. However, many were misled and on departure were given a stamp on their card which showed that that they have been county charities. So that's what it would say on their stamp card.
Oh,
This meant that they would be denied readmission since they would be liable to become a public charge. So basically, as they left, they would get this stamp on their passport that said, if they come back, they're gonna need public resources. Don't let them back in. So that's what
right.
the liable to become a public charge meant. So a public charge refers, excuse me, a public charge refers to a term used in U.S. immigration law describing an individual who is considered primarily dependent on the government for subsistence, and as demonstrated by either the receipt of public cash assistance or income maintenance or institutionalization for long-term care at government expense. So, when determining if an immigrant will become a public charge, immigration officers often consider factors such as age, health, family status, assets, resources, financial, etc. So basically, they would just mark these people and say, if they come back, they're going to be a burden. Don't let them back in, and then they wouldn't be allowed back into the country.
Yeah,
My
so they
God.
you would just get kind of like blacklisted essentially.
Yeah, and many of them weren't. This wasn't explained to them, so they were just trying to go along with the process. And on the way out, they would just get stamped, and it's like
Yeah.
that was it. Yeah, so euphemistically referred to as repatriations, the removals were anything but voluntary. So sometimes private employers drove their employees to the border and literally kicked them out. In other
Oh
cases, local
gosh.
governments cut off relief, raided gathering places, or offered free train fare to Mexico.
Yeah, now
Um,
I'm sorry, Marcelo. Was this during the period like I know this has been done up until rather recently, but like that thing where like okay, come over, work a season, I'll pay you to the end of the season,
mhm.
and then the owner of the farm will just go ahead and turn them over to the
Yes,
INS. Okay, so
yes.
that was that sort of thing before they got paid, just kind of
Hmm.
turn them in.
Yeah, either way, like as long as they got them there, like it didn't really matter. Um, because most of the people who would turn them in, the Americans, were seen as doing a service. They were trying to help their country by getting rid of this problem. Um, so, so yeah, so they would kick them out. In other cases, local governments cut off aid. They would raid places that people would gather. They offered the free train fare, and then Colorado even ordered all of its Mexicans. Uh, that's how they said it. We order all of Colorado's Mexicans, in reality, anyone who spoke Spanish or seemed to be of Latin descent, to leave the state in 1936. So
Gee,
Colorado just straight up said, Mexicans out. Like we're we're good. Um, and to leave the state in 1936, and then blockaded its southern border to keep people from returning. Though no formal decree was ever issued by immigration authorities, INS officials have deported about 82,000 people during this period. The impact on Spanish-speaking communities was pretty devastating. Some light-skinned Mexican Americans attempted to pass themselves off as Spanish, not Mexican, in an attempt to evade enforcement, and people with disabilities and active illnesses were removed from hospitals and dumped at the border.
oh,
As
fuck
one
me,
victim
man.
of repatriation told Raymond Rodriguez, who wrote a history of the period, Decade of Betrayal, they might as well have sent us to Mars. So these are the kinds of things that were happening in Detroit. Now we're going to jump over to Texas, which will be our last stop, I think, on this half of the episode, just for all of our sakes and also for our time's sake.
It's been a great
Oh
tour so
man.
far. Really enjoying
Really has been quite the tour.
down to Texas. I
So,
assume food was given away and
yeah. Every love was
tournament.
given and Christ was offered. So in Texas, there was misinformation and psychological tactics that were used. This was during the 1930s. So in Texas, where any anti-Mexican sentiment was intense, local officials and employers spread rumors about deportation sweeps and welfare cutoffs to force Mexican American families to leave. So authorities organized voluntary repatriation meetings, often held in public spaces, where they painted a grim picture of life if families chose to stay. Officials would imply that deportation was inevitable, pushing families to agree to repatriation to avoid what was presented as harsher alternatives. So life is going to get really bad for you here. You should really just leave, you know? Um, One account was from a migrant named Maria Ruiz, who recalled how her family and others were frightened into leaving. As rumors spread that even US-born children would be taken from families, they said, quote, they said the police would come, that they'd make us leave. She remembered Ruiz's account recorded in oral history collections described the fear in her community and how the psychological pressure applied by officials left them feeling. So they had no other choice but to leave everything behind. So, because many of the repatriation attempts were informal or conducted by private companies, it is nearly impossible to quantify the exact number of people who were deported. So, but when deportations finally ended around 1936, it's estimated that up to 2 million Mexican Americans had been repatriated, and around one-third of Los Angeles Mexican population left the country, as did a third of Texas's Mexican-born population. Though both the state of California and the city of Los Angeles have since apologized for repatriation in the early 2000s, the deportations have largely faded from public memory. This is all from USCIS.gov. So this next part here is, yeah, this is a quote from the government website about the government's response to the repatriation. So, quote, voluntary repatriations in which INS played only an indirect role account for a portion of the Mexicans who left the U.S. during the Depression. In 1931, the INS reported that the number of Mexicans returning to Mexico had, quote, reached large proportions, but offered no numerical estimate. One historian, however, has concluded that between November 1929 and December 1931, about 200,000 Mexicans left the U.S. Today, we would not expect to find an INS record for these non-federally mandated departures.
Hmm.
In most cases, however, no federal record exists for these departures. This is because while an estimated 400,000 to 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans left the U.S. for Mexico during the Depression, relatively few of them were expelled under formal INS-directed removal proceedings. The majority returned to Mexico by their own decision or through officially voluntary, though often coercive, repatriation programs directed by the state and local governments and charitable aid agencies. Likewise, in 1933, the INS reported that the state of Michigan, quote, sent 1,500 Mexicans to the border, accompanied by an immigration service escort, because these migrants were removed under a state-sponsored program. It is unlikely that INS deportation files exist for them either. So basically, they got rid of all these people in an unofficial manner and did not document it purposely.
Right.
Um, because they didn't want anything slowing down like the US citizens. So that's why so many people who were US citizens got taken out because they were like, well, we don't need this. Like, come on, let's get you going. No papers.
Yeah, no, it's just kind of like the whole, you know, don't worry about it. We got it covered. You have to do this. And like, you know, just kind of rushing people into things that they really don't understand. That's a big part of what happens even today,
Mhm.
you know?
Um,
Exactly.
and I mean, for right now, I think that's probably the place I would like to end this this uplifting episode of people. Basically, this is the point where um, the majority of the people that are being deported out of the US again are being sent to Mexico, and I think in our next episode we're going to start talking about what happens when they get there. So in the next episode we're going to have a conversation about what kinds of things the US, or excuse me, the Mexican government did to try to prepare for all these people coming, and in what ways it like completely failed in
Hmm.
actually being able to receive them. Um, so this journey of these people doesn't just go from like, hey, they left the US and then they were fine in Mexico. It gets very, very complicated, and a lot of people have a pretty tough time. And a lot of them still end up trying to come back to their homes in the US because many of them were native born. And then a lot of them don't. And so next episode, we're going to talk about what happens when all of these people actually are deported and where they go and how that also affects our country, or excuse me, how that affected the US, as well as how that affects the country that they fall back into. And with that, that is part one of Mexican repatriation.
Well, hot damn, Marcelo, that
I'm
was a tough part
speechless,
one.
dude. Oh my god.
So
We
I'm
are
gonna.
just the worst.
Well, I mean, I just, I can't help but think, and you might get into this one in the second episode, but, you have these people that come up or, just trying to make a better life for themselves and their family. And, they do everything correctly. They start a life here and then they get, uprooted. And, even though it was reactionary like politics, in the end, it does affect these people like long term, like generation.
Generationally, yeah, for
Generational.
sure. No,
Yes.
yeah, that shit is yeah, man, like I didn't talk about it too much because we were already kind of running long, but like I personally experienced like a lot of this like raid stuff. Like there's a certain hue of green on like a bus or like a police vehicle or like whatever, an official vehicle that like kicks off like some fight or flight thing in my bones. You know what I mean? Like that border patrol green. Like that shit like does something when I see it, you know?
Yeah.
Because this was a reality for me in like the 90s, like uh living with, undocumented mixed status family, like um this was a concern. Like
Yeah.
somebody picking you up on like a Sunday was a real fear. Um I wanted to give you guys a little preview about next episode because one of the things that we are going to have to talk about is going to be the Mexican Revolution that was happening while this was also occurring. So that's kind of what a lot of these folks are going back into, is a country it's rebuilding itself after a revolution. Um, One of the groups that we're going to get to meet briefly, but we'll meet them, is this little group of people here. And I'm sorry the picture's kind of faded, but it is it is a armed Catholic militia that was happening, like that was active during the time of repatriation, a little bit before and a little bit during. But they're a fun little group of people we're going to meet who were pretty cool. Um,
Wow.
yeah, they were kind of like a religious matriarchal based society where everybody also had guns. Yeah, they were interesting. So we're going to be talking about them a little bit too, and a couple of pretty interesting stories about people and how they adapted and how they survived, and in some cases how they made it back to their homes and forged lives. And there's going to be some pretty cool human stuff going on there. There will also be a brief little touching on of some more modern things. Um,
Oh,
because
fuck yeah.
I can't wait to hear about it.
because
I'm just happy they didn't say Moss.
I mean,
Sorry.
say Musk, just say Musk
Oh,
from now.
Moss.
Musk deportations.
Oh,
But yeah, so I think that we'll be doing something in this next episode that we may have not. I mean, we've kind of always sort of like touched and dabbled on certain things, but like I feel like this topic is just so like kind of hyper relevant right now, and even though we don't need it to be, like it's just something that's happening that we should just all be sort of, just aware of,
yeah. No, no, 100%. I'm glad you're kind of, bringing this kind of story to us. I kind of want to do more of these types of story along with some of our more goofy and fun stories or some of our more like
a little
outlaw
sugar.
stories from the 1800s. But I do want to do, great stories like this and not great. I guess maybe the wrong word, but,
Yeah, just
stuff.
to kind of, I just feel like there's like, I mean, one of the things I love doing about this with you guys is that like we talk about these things and that like have happened in the past, and like for a time where like everything is like unprecedented and like we don't know what's going to happen. Like I don't know, man, like nobody ever did know what was going to happen, and they kind of just, like Like
Yeah.
the first time all these things happened, like no one knew how to deal with it then, and they somehow did. And like, I don't know, maybe like informing ourselves or just at least knowing that like, I don't know, like being able to see the outline that like history has like done for us. It can help some people with their anxiety, hopefully.
No, no,
Um,
100%. Just knowing that, like, these are patterns. If you're looking at, like, the time frame with all these events, I mean, it's
it's like about 100 years.
just 100 years ago, and so it does, it does make you think, and there is solace you can kind of take in these kind of issues or something we've always been facing. Um, but at the same time, we need to recognize we should try to, in my view, we should try to recognize opportunities where we can to make things, not as shitty.
Yeah, or just know that like things have gotten shitty in the past, and like once you know what's coming, or if you know some version of what has happened, like you can prepare for it, and you can like weather it, like with with like the people you care about, or like with like-minded people, whatever, like like um there'll be another day.
Yeah.
All right. Well, any final thoughts, anyone?
Jess, you look like you look like you went
I'm
through a whole thing there.
we went
Poor Jess is
we went to several places with this episode, and like I said, I'm just speechless. Like, I am so thankful that that you're telling this story though. So,
I'm glad to get it out of my part of it out of my head, because it has been hanging out in here for
I
for a
mean,
couple of weeks.
I imagine that most people nowadays have no idea about this story. I certainly did not. I'm very happy that I do know about it now. And yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing what the other part is gonna be about. And I really hope that more people tune into this episode and hear the story, and hopefully they'll come back and listen to the other half.
Yeah, if you guys like trauma stories, come on through. We got lots of history.
yeah.
Come on,
Please
white
like and
people.
subscribe. God, that's a poor way to end that.
Once you're done reading those 5 books about generational trauma, come through. We got you.
All right. Well, I think that just about wraps it up for this episode. Again, this is Mason Orlando. Keep climbing. Whew.
And till next time, lovelies.
And don't get deported. Just go take a hike.
Yeah, just take a hike.
Just take a hike and don't get, yeah.
And then keep hiking.
And then keep
Yeah, I guess.